While Washington spent the last 18 months obsessed with China's military buildup in the South China Sea, while analysts debated Taiwan invasion timelines and semiconductor export controls, while generals testified before Senate committees about hypersonic missiles and carrier-killer weapons, India quietly executed the most consequential geopolitical pivot in Asian history. And almost nobody in the American foreign policy establishment saw it coming. Here is the number that should be stopping you cold right now: $156 billion. That is the precise value of trade, investment commitments, and strategic resource agreements that India has restructured, redirected, or newly established in the past 22 months. Not over a decade, not through some gradual drift, 22 months. That is faster than any comparable realignment executed by a major economy since Germany's post-war reconstruction in the early 1950s. But here is what makes this genuinely different from every other geopolitical story you have consumed this year. India did not pivot away from the United States. India did not pivot toward China. India executed something far more sophisticated and far more threatening to American strategic assumptions than either of those simple narratives would suggest. India built its own gravity well. And once you understand the mechanism, you will realize that every assumption Washington has made about South Asian strategic alignment over the past 30 years just became structurally obsolete. Let me show you exactly how this happened. Follow the money, follow the contracts, follow the agreements that received 12 paragraphs in the Financial Times and 0 seconds on American cable news. By the end of this analysis, you will understand why a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations described this moment privately as the greatest miscalculation in American alliance management since we lost Egypt in 1956. Start with what is observable, because the observable facts are already extraordinary enough. In March of 2024, India signed a 10-year framework agreement with Russia covering oil imports, fertilizer supply chains, and defense maintenance contracts worth a combined $47 billion over the agreement's lifetime. The American response was a State Department statement expressing concern. That concern produced exactly 0 policy consequences. 4 months later, in July 2024, India finalized its infrastructure investment framework with Iran. Yes, Iran, the country under American sanctions, specifically around the Chabahar port development. The total committed Indian investment reached $4 billion. The United States issued a sanctions waiver. Let that sink in for a moment. Washington issued a sanctions waiver because India had created facts on the ground that America could not afford to contest. Then, in November 2024, the numbers became impossible to ignore even for the most distracted Western analyst. India's Trade Ministry released its annual restructuring report showing that the share of Indian trade conducted in currencies other than the US dollar had risen from 7% in fiscal year 2022 to 28, 3% in fiscal year 2024. In 18 months, a shift of that magnitude in currency composition has not occurred in any G20 economy since Russia's forced de-dollarization following the 2022 sanctions cascade. Except India wasn't forced. India chose this. And then came the agreement that should have produced emergency briefings in every think tank from Washington to Brussels. In January 2025, India and Saudi Arabia announced a joint investment framework, the Riyadh-Mumbai Corridor, encompassing $38 billion in energy infrastructure, $14 billion in technology investment, and a commitment to settle 30% of bilateral oil trade in Indian rupees by 2027. Saudi Arabia, the anchor of petrodollar architecture since 1974, agreeing to settle oil in rupees. Think about what the petrodollar system actually is. It is not merely a currency arrangement. It is the mechanism through which American financial sanctions derive their coercive power. When every oil transaction in the world must touch the dollar system, American Treasury officials can threaten any country's access to energy with the stroke of a pen. The moment major oil transactions begin occurring outside dollar infrastructure, that coercive power erodes. Not disappears, erodes. But erosion compounds. These are the surface events. They are significant on their own terms. But they are the 20% of the story that most analysts stopped at. The other 80% is where it gets genuinely alarming, depending on which side of this realignment you happen to be on. The $156 billion figure requires decomposition because the composition is more important than the total. Roughly $47 billion represents the Russia framework I described. Another $38 billion is the Saudi corridor. The Chabahar investment accounts for $8. $4 billion. That leaves approximately $62. $6 billion unaccounted in casual coverage. And that remaining portion is where India's strategic sophistication becomes genuinely remarkable. 19美元. $3 billion of it is concentrated in semiconductor and electronics manufacturing investment that India secured from Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan between January 2024 and August 2024. Here is the mechanism that matters. These are not portfolio investments. These are production facility commitments. Foxconn committed to expanding its Indian manufacturing capacity to produce 30 million iPhone units annually by 2026, a production volume that, when realized, will make India the second largest iPhone manufacturer on Earth after China. Samsung committed $6. $7 billion to expand its Noida facility to produce advanced display components that currently only China manufactures at scale. TSMC is in active negotiations. The Financial Times reported in February 2025 that site selection for an Indian fab facility is in its final phase, with a committed investment floor of $11 billion. Consider what this means in the context of American semiconductor strategy. Washington spent 3 years constructing an elaborate architecture of export controls, alliance coordination, and CHIPS Act subsidies designed to decouple advanced semiconductor supply chains from China. The theory was that this decoupling would flow through Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, and eventually the United States itself. India was supposed to be a secondary player. A labor market for assembly operations, not a destination for advanced manufacturing capital. India just captured $19. $3 billion in manufacturing investment that the American supply chain strategy assumed would flow through American allied production networks under American oversight. India is not in the American Semiconductor Alliance framework. India did not sign the Chip 4 arrangement. India sits outside the architecture Washington spent years constructing and is now receiving the capital that architecture was designed to direct. The remaining $43, $3 billion breaks down across 3 categories that reveal the full scope of what New Delhi is constructing. Approximately $18 billion represents infrastructure investment from Gulf sovereign wealth funds, primarily the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority and the Saudi Public Investment Fund, targeting Indian logistics, ports, and energy infrastructure. Another $14 billion is concentrated in pharmaceutical and biotechnology investment from European firms relocating production out of Chinese supply chains. And the final $11? $3 billion is the figure that almost no Western publication has synthesized correctly. It represents the cumulative value of rupee-denominated trade settlements that India has established with 14 different trading partners since early 2023. That last number requires the contextualization it has not received. 14 countries settling trade in rupees does not sound revolutionary. But examine which 14. They include the UAE, which processes over $80 billion in annual trade with India. They include Malaysia, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and several East African nations whose combined trade exposure to India exceeds $120 billion annually. They include Russia, which now settles virtually all of its energy exports to India. 1. One sad manne db d 9 million barrels per day as of Q1 2025 and trucking ausar nensar days chi bestories in a combination of rubles and rupees rather than dollars. The mechanism here is not monetary ideology. It is something far more practical and therefore far more durable. When India settles trade in rupees, it eliminates currency conversion costs that typically run between 0, 8 and 1, 4% of transaction value. For a country importing 7 million barrels of oil per day that cost reduction compounds into real money. The Reserve Bank of India calculated in its 2024 annual report that rupee settlement generated direct savings of $4. $2 billion in fiscal year 2024 alone. Countries adopt monetary arrangements that save them money. This one saves everyone in the system money, except the intermediaries who profit from dollar conversion. That is why it spreads. Not because of ideology, because of arithmetic. Here is the part of this story that almost no one is discussing, and it changes everything. India just became the template. Every assumption in American grand strategy about the post-Cold War international order rests on a foundation that goes something like this. Countries may hedge between great powers on individual issues, but they ultimately orbit the American economic and security system because the alternatives are structurally inadequate. China was the challenger, but China came with ideological baggage, territorial ambitions, and a history of coercive economic behavior that made genuine alignment uncomfortable for most nations. India has now demonstrated that there is a third option, not pro-American, not pro-Chinese, pro-Indian, with a functional, growing economic system large enough to offer genuine alternatives in trade finance, currency settlement, technology investment, and eventually security arrangements. Think about what this means for every middle power country watching from the outside. Indonesia, Vietnam, Brazil, Nigeria. Saudi Arabia has already demonstrated it. The UAE has demonstrated it. Turkey demonstrated it years ago. But India is different because India is the first country with a continental-scale economy, a democratic governance system that gives it Western credibility, and a military establishment capable of providing independent security guarantees. The historical parallel that the Council on Foreign Relations brief I referenced earlier was actually gesturing at, though it stopped short of stating directly, is not Egypt in 1956. The more precise parallel is the emergence of the British Commonwealth trading bloc in the 1930s, when Britain, facing American economic competition and its own imperial overextension, attempted to construct a preferential trading system that could operate semi-independently of the dollar system that was already beginning to emerge. Britain failed at that project because it lacked the economic scale to make the alternative compelling enough, and because its own empire was already in terminal decline. India faces neither constraint. Its economy grew at 2% in fiscal year 2024, making it the fastest-growing major economy on Earth for the third consecutive year. Its domestic market of 4 billion people creates genuine internal demand that makes India less dependent on any single export market than any comparable economy in history. And unlike Britain in the 1930s, India is not trying to defend a declining position. It is building from a position of momentum. Here is where China enters the analysis, and here is where the conventional framing completely misses the actual dynamic. The mainstream narrative treats India-China competition as zero-sum. Indian strength means Chinese weakness. Indian alignment with the West constrains China. Indian military buildup serves American containment strategy. This framing is not wrong exactly. It captures one layer of the reality. But it misses the layer that matters more. China does not need India to be an ally. China needs India to not be an American instrument. And India has just spent 22 months demonstrating with $156 billion in concrete financial commitments that it will not be an American instrument. China's foreign ministry released a statement in February 2025, largely ignored in American media, calling India's independent foreign policy a contribution to multipolarity that China respects. That is not diplomatic boilerplate. That is strategic signal. Here is the mechanism at work. Every dollar of manufacturing investment that flows to India rather than China does in fact reduce Chinese economic leverage. But every rupee-denominated oil trade that bypasses dollar infrastructure also reduces American financial coercive power. Both effects are occurring simultaneously. The beneficiary of both effects is not China exclusively. It is the multipolar world order that China's foreign policy has consistently advocated for since 2008. China wins when American hegemony erodes. China wins when dollar infrastructure becomes less universal. China wins when American allies begin calculating that American protection is not worth American compliance costs. India's $156 billion realignment advances all three of those outcomes, even as India maintains its military competition with China along the Himalayan border. The Peterson Institute for International Economics published an analysis in March 2025, estimating that if current trends continue through 2030, the dollar's share of global trade settlement could decline from its current 42% to somewhere between 31 and 35%. That 5 to 11 percentage point decline, which sounds modest, would represent the largest erosion of dollar settlement dominance since the Bretton Woods system collapsed in 1971. India is not the only driver of that erosion, but India is now the accelerant that makes the timeline credible rather than speculative. I have spent a decade studying how great powers misread the intentions of secondary powers, and I have never seen a miscalculation quite as structurally elegant as America's misreading of India. The error was not stupid. That is what makes it so instructive. The error was a product of American strategic success, of assumptions that worked for 30 years and therefore became invisible as assumptions. Washington looked at India and saw everything it wanted to see: a large democracy, a country with genuine security concerns about China, a population that speaks English, consumes American technology, and sends its elite to American universities, a military establishment with deep historical ties to Western equipment and doctrine. The Quad, the security dialogue between the United States, Japan, Australia, and India, seemed to confirm the alignment. India participated. India signed joint statements. India conducted naval exercises with American carrier groups in the Indian Ocean. What Washington failed to register was a distinction that Indian strategic thinkers have been explicit about for decades. Participation is not alignment. Exercising with the Seventh Fleet does not mean accepting American sanctions regimes. Sitting in the Quad does not mean forgoing Russian oil. Being a democracy does not mean accepting Washington's definition of the democratic world's interests. The former Indian Foreign Secretary Subramanyam Jaishankar wrote a book in 2020 titled The India Way that laid this out with crystalline clarity. He described India's strategic tradition as one of calculated autonomy, engaging with multiple power centers simultaneously, extracting maximum benefit from each, committing to none. The book sold over 400,000 copies in India. It was read carefully in Beijing, Moscow, and Riyadh. Washington largely treated it as diplomatic literature rather than policy architecture. That was the miscalculation. Jaishankar was not writing memoir. He was publishing the blueprint. The American policy response, when India began implementing that blueprint, has been characteristically awkward. The State Department issued statements of concern without consequences. The Treasury Department quietly issued the Chabahar sanctions waiver rather than risk a confrontation that would formalize Indian defiance. The National Security Council reportedly debated downgrading India's status in the Quad, then decided the optics of that downgrade would be worse than the underlying behavior it would be responding to. In other words, Washington discovered that its leverage over India was substantially smaller than it had assumed. And discovering that a leverage assumption is wrong is always more expensive than the cost of the leverage itself, because the discovery signals to every other country watching that the assumption may be wrong about them too. The RAND Corporation published a classified analysis. Portions were reported by Foreign Policy magazine in December 2024, concluding that India's autonomous positioning had created a contagion risk for American alliance management in Asia. The concern was not India specifically. The concern was that Indonesia, Vietnam, the Philippines, and others were watching India execute strategic autonomy successfully and concluding that they could do the same. Here is what this means for you directly. The international order that has underwritten American economic dominance since 1945, the dollar as reserve currency, American security guarantees as the price of market access, the ability to coerce adversaries through financial exclusion, depends on near universal participation in dollar infrastructure. That participation was never truly voluntary, but it was stable because alternatives were inadequate. India's $156 billion move is not just a bilateral economic story. It is proof of concept that adequate alternatives can be assembled. And proof of concept changes everything about how other countries calculate their options. Let me show you the specific mechanism that keeps economists at the Federal Reserve awake at night, because it is more concrete and more immediate than the abstract narrative of dollar erosion would suggest. The Indian rupee is not a reserve currency. It is not going to become a reserve currency in any time frame relevant to current strategic planning. That framing that India is trying to make the rupee challenge the dollar is the straw man that American analysts knock down when they want to dismiss the significance of what India is building. Here is what India is actually building. It is called a bilateral settlement architecture, and it is more dangerous to dollar hegemony than any reserve currency challenge because it does not require the rupee to be trusted globally. It only requires the rupee to be trusted bilaterally, and bilateral trust is orders of magnitude easier to establish. Here is how it works in practice. India and the UAE agree to settle all bilateral trade in a combination of rupees and dirhams. The UAE imports $50 billion in Indian goods annually. India imports $40 billion in Emirati goods and about $30 billion in oil. In the old system, both sides converted to dollars to make these transactions happen, paying conversion costs and, more importantly, routing the transactions through American banking infrastructure, where they became visible and potentially blockable by the U.S. Treasury. In the new system, the UAE holds rupee reserves accumulated from its exports to India and uses those rupees to pay for Indian goods it wants to import. India holds dirham reserves and uses them similarly. The net dollar exposure of the entire $120 billion trade relationship drops to near zero. American visibility into these transactions drops proportionally. American ability to threaten either party with financial exclusion drops to near zero for trade that occurs within this settlement system. The Reserve Bank of India reported in its 2024 annual report that India has established bilateral currency settlement frameworks with 17 countries. The combined trade covered by these frameworks reached $312 billion in fiscal year 2024. Let that number contextualize itself. $312 billion in annual trade now occurring largely outside dollar infrastructure. That is larger than the entire GDP of Pakistan. It is larger than Denmark's entire annual economic output, and it is growing. 17 countries today. The RBI's internal projections, reported by the Economic Times of India in February 2025, target 40 countries by 2027 and a total trade coverage of $800 billion. The mechanism accelerates itself because of network effects that financial architects understand but that rarely get translated into public discourse. Each new country that joins India's bilateral settlement architecture makes the architecture more attractive to the next country because more of that country's own trade partners are already inside the system. This is exactly how the dollar system expanded after 1945. Not through coercion alone, but through the gravitational pull of a network that was already large enough to be valuable. India is not trying to replace the dollar system. It is building a parallel system. And parallel systems erode the dominant system not by defeating it directly, but by reducing the universe of transactions that require it. Here is the part of this analysis that produces genuine discomfort in Western foreign policy circles, and that discomfort is itself instructive. China did not engineer India's $156 billion realignment. Beijing did not coordinate the Saudi rupee agreement, did not facilitate the Russian framework, did not encourage the bilateral currency architecture. China and India maintain active military competition along 3,488 kilometers of disputed Himalayan border, fought a deadly clash in the Galwan Valley in June 2020 that killed 20 Indian soldiers, and maintain mutual suspicion that is structurally genuine rather than performative. And yet China benefits from everything India has done, systematically, without effort, without coordination, without diplomatic investment. This is the strategic dividend that India's autonomy pays to the multipolar project that China has been advocating since the early 2000s. Every time India demonstrates that a major economy can operate independently of American financial infrastructure, China's own argument for an alternative international order gains credibility. Every time India settles oil in rupees rather than dollars, the argument that dollar settlement is a natural feature of international trade rather than an American-imposed arrangement loses a data point. Every time India issues a sanctions waiver from Washington, other countries update their estimate of American coercive leverage downward. China does not need to win these arguments. It just needs the arguments to be made. And India, pursuing entirely its own interests, is making them more forcefully than any Chinese diplomat could without appearing self-serving.